You may think you know this space agency, but you don't. NASA is not the sum of its publicly presented parts. I'm not simply talking about classified research and development. I'm talking about the dozens of space programs veiled from prying eyes, programs hidden even from many folk within the company. And when I was finally offered the privilege of peering behind the curtain, I found myself at the eye of an unprecedented storm. A disaster beyond the bounds of earthly horror, the GE1 mission. Since the climax of the space race, a consensus has grown, a prevailing belief that NASA has abandoned the final frontier. It is, however, an absurd notion that the brightest minds of this agency no longer care about space's mysteries. The truth is that our best scientists decided decades ago to shield humanity from the hellish things we uncovered, things lying in the pits of space that no light reaches. NASA projects featured in the media have low stakes. Even the International Space Station sits at the foot of this organization's priorities. Significant expeditions are classified. The ones intended to catapult humanity towards the stars, for instance. The ones using spacecraft beyond what the average person deems possible with human technology. We are capable of things that would leave you awestruck. We are capable of things that would leave you cold. The GE1 spacecraft launched on Wednesday, 25th January 2023. It sailed beyond our solar system, pursuing a slow signal that was coursing through the outer reaches of the Milky Way. Not an intelligible transmission, but a frequency that intrigued us nonetheless. A frequency named 784A. Hysteria swept the company on the date of the signal's first interception. Saturday, 29th October 2022. Given 784A's ever-moving source, the frequency sparked feverish intrigue. Regarding the nature of the mysterious moving signal, there seemed to be a different hypothesis from every NASA employee with clearance. It was, truly, an exhilarating time. And things reached a fever pitch when the GE1 craft launched a few months later. Employees weren't eating or sleeping. They spent their waking hours sharing ideas about the mysterious transmission from space. A circuit board of explanations that finally overloaded on Thursday, 2nd February 2023, the day on which the GE1 stopped responding to NASA. 1 week later, on Thursday, 9th February, the signal from the spacecraft returned. Commander Irwin, this is Mission Control, Dr. Parker, the head of the project, announced. Mission Control to GE1. Do you copy? Roger, Mission Control, Commander Tim Irwin responded. We've been trying to reach you. We lost contact with GE1 7 days ago, Commander. What happened? What is your status? Dr. Parker asked. All systems are fine, Mission Control, Irwin replied. Dr. Parker seemed flustered by the commander's nonchalant demeanor. The project leader clawed at his gray, thinning hair with tense fingers. The old man seemed to be carefully considering his next utterance. 7 days without contact, Commander? 7. GE1 disappeared at our end. Do you have a status report? Anything which might explain why we were unable to communicate with one another? Parker asked. Nothing, Mission Control, Irwin blankly replied. As for 784A, we reached the transmission point of the signal. There was nothing to be found. We have collected as much data as possible, requesting clearance to return home. There were several minutes of nervous mumbling from various scientists and board members. Dr. Parker looked broken beyond measure by the time he leaned forwards, heavy breath beating against the microphone. He was trembling with a mixture of rage and confusion. Roger, Commander Irwin, you have clearance to come home, Parked croakily whispered. On a vessel traversing space at an unfathomable pace, the astronauts returned home. The craft silently landed at an unofficial NASA site on Wednesday, 15th February, 2023. The GE1 crew emerged, greeted by a small, applauding crowd. Tim Irwin, Gianna Danes, and Matthias Olsson. Those were the 3 astronauts who supposedly emerged from the spacecraft. And at first, we had no reason to believe anything else. We recognized the 3 faces, the 3 voices, the 3 brilliant minds. However, it did not take long for slight oddities to slip through the cracks. I overheard something perplexing whilst Tim Irwin spoke to his wife, Melissa Irwin, in the break room. I love you, Melody, the astronaut said. Melissa frowned, smiling awkwardly. Melody? Who is Melody? I didn't intend to eavesdrop. I'd been helping myself to a drink. Still, I slowed down when I heard that. Melissa was clearly teasing her exhausted husband, but there was a slight tinge of uncertainty in her voice. And I'll admit that I was a little too nosy. I pretended to weigh up 2 different drinks before I made my way out of the room. As a result, I managed to catch the tail end of the commander's strange fumble. Irwin cleared his throat. I'm sorry, honey. I forgot my wife's name, Melissa laughed, finishing his sentence. No worries, honey. It's Melissa, by the way. Just to let you know, I didn't realize I had to worry about you finding another woman in space. I know your name, Tim icily sliced. I froze, halfway out of the door, as Melissa replied with a timid voice. Sorry, sweetie. I know. I was only joking, she assured. Your head must be all over the place. You look like you need a good rest. I laughed to myself once I was out of earshot, but I felt the same as Melissa. Something was slightly uneven about Tim's disposition. It wasn't simply a sleep-deprived brain. I knew that, and she knew that. The commander's voice changed when his wife confronted him. It didn't sound like the astronaut any longer. I didn't know Tim incredibly well, but I knew that he was different. Whatever the case, I would have forgotten about the entire thing, dismissing my gut feeling as the result of a nerve-wracking week or two. Everybody had been unsettled since GE1 lost its signal. We were still recovering from the stress of those awful 7 days without any communication with the spacecraft. There is one other thing worth mentioning from the day of GE1's return. One of my coworkers claimed to find Gianna Danes standing alone in a corridor, staring at a bathroom door, not entering, not moving. Sleep deprivation, I thought again. 1 year later, that explanation no longer sufficed. On Wednesday, 31st January 2024, an unidentified object entered Earth's atmosphere, tumbling into the Pacific Ocean. A catastrophe that was only brought to NASA's attention because the object in question utilized advanced cloaking technology, though it did not broadcast a signal. It was a government satellite that detected the craft. And when specialists identified that they had detected technology used by Dozen Minus, our primary government contractor, NASA immediately sent a recovery team to the ocean site. That was as much as I knew until Dr. Parker knocked on my door. I'd appreciate your input, he said. Pardon? I replied, fearing for a moment that I'd have to join the exploration team. You're one of only 24 people who were involved with the GE1 project, Parker explained, as if that were enough information. I don't understand. That project ended a year ago, I said. Dr. Parker's brow furrowed. Please come with me, Dr. Odell. And then, after following the man to the control room, I learned something which my brain, usually eager to embrace the unknown, wanted so desperately to unlearn. On the ocean floor, thousands of feet below the water's surface, NASA found the GE1 spacecraft. What? I gasped. We don't know, Dr. Parker replied. I need your help, though. Why? I weakly asked. I don't understand any of this. The GE1 is sitting in a hangar, isn't it? Yes, Dr. Parker nodded. But it's also sitting at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, 3,000 miles off the east coast. My face whitened, and the man nodded. Take your time to process that, he said. I'm still working on wrapping my head around it. After a minute or so, I finally summoned a question that I didn't find utterly foolish or uneducated. It's the exact same spacecraft, identical in every way? I asked. The project leader sighed. Well, yes and no. Why am I here, Dr. Parker? I asked. The recovery team has not explored the craft yet, the man replied. But we have conducted a preliminary exploration with an unmanned vessel. UV-7. Movement was detected within the craft. Christ, I gasped. Parker continued. It's unsettling. The room is divided. Some specialists think a living organism might be down there, but others think it may have been a dislodged piece of equipment. The UV-7 didn't transmit any biological information. Anyway, that's why I wanted to bring you into the room. You're one of this organization's leading biologists, after all. I scoffed. I specialize in cell and molecular biology. Well, what is this? What have we even found here? Nothing, Parker said. That's my verdict, but Dr. Long disagrees. I mentioned your name to them, and I'm hoping you'll help me. How? I asked. By proving what the UV-7 has already told us, he answered. Whatever moved down there, it wasn't living. It wasn't organic in nature, unless a fish happened to... No, it couldn't have been. As I said, the UV-7 would have detected a biological signal. I agreed to offer my opinion. I shouldn't have done so, but but I did. It would have been easy to ask Dr. Parker to choose someone else, give someone else clearance. I wasn't exactly emotionally invested in the GE1 program. It had been a year since the astronauts supposedly returned, and we'd found nothing at the source of the 784A frequency. Since then, I'd moved on to bigger and better things. Of course, everything changed when Parker revealed that an identical version of the GE1 spacecraft existed at the bottom of the ocean. It was a discovery far beyond anything I'd experienced during 13 years at NASA. I needed an answer to the unknown. 2 hours later, with no more than 20 people in the control room, we watched live footage of the submarine's dive towards the GE1 crash site. The mission was a joint venture between NASA and a privately contracted company, with all participating crew members legally bound to an NDA. After all, they were about to explore a spacecraft which, in the public realm, did not exist. After the initial flurry of breathtaking aquatic species, it took another 2 torturous hours for the video feed to display anything other than blackness. The vessel descended into the depths of the ocean, the part that light didn't reach. I thought about its similarity to space. I found it ridiculous to think about the fact that we have ignored a frontier on our own planet before exploring the one beyond it. So much of the ocean remains unexplored. Eventually, the contractors found the wreckage, and 2 divers, each fitted with a camera, left the submarine to explore the vessel. When they rounded the battered nose of the spacecraft, mission control fell silent. We all saw it at the same time. The bold letters printed on the crumpled wreckage of the sunken craft, which was half buried in the black seabed. GE1. Hearing about the discovery was one thing. Seeing it on a gargantuan screen was something else. Dr. Parker was no liar. I knew that, but I still didn't believe him until I saw the footage for myself. Breaching the airlock now, the lead diver Barton announced. Disturbed water swirled into a stream of bubbles, clouding the lens of Barton's camera as he used a piece of specialized drilling equipment. It was a long and arduous process, during which Mission Control only had a limited view of the spectacle through the camera of Lee, the second diver. "That'll do it," Barton's colleague said. The bubbles started to disperse as the drill ceased, and we watched the 2 explorers break the airlock's mechanism before pulling the hatch towards them. They revealed a void within the opening, and the lights on their headsets did very little to illuminate the innards of the craft. I sensed that the 2 men were apprehensive about entering the wreckage. They likely knew very little about NASA's GE1 program. That, in the end, was for the best. We all long for that privilege. "Entering the vehicle," Barton uneasily said. The lead diver swam through the opening, followed a couple of seconds later by Lee, who may well have been on the verge of turning and retreating to the submarine. The split screen revealed 2 pieces of footage, barely different in perspective. 2 views of the same bleak, water-filled tunnel. The entrance to a vessel that had once traversed space, only to meet its end in a watery grave. "Are we broadcasting clear footage?" Lee asked. "Yes," Dr. Parker responded. "If you follow the main hallway, you'll reach GE1's flight deck." "Not seeing any obstructions," Barton said. "Should be manageable." The pair continued to swim through the hallway of the craft, which, as Barton had noted, was remarkably intact. None of the carnage and chaos we'd expected to find. Then again, we shouldn't have been surprised. There were minimal tears in the exterior of the craft. Given the level of investment placed into developing a vessel far beyond mankind's perceived capabilities, it seemed plausible that the craft had mostly survived both a dangerous re-entry and a high-speed collision with the water. What did not seem plausible was Parker's explanation that we were looking at a carbon copy of an existing spacecraft, one which I'd watched land on Earth a year earlier. I had no reason to believe that everybody in the room had to be lying to me, but something in my brain refused to compute such an impossibility. I wouldn't have ever believed Dr. Parker, even if I'd gone to the hangar and physically seen the craft in person, before swimming to the bottom of the ocean to view its twin. Even after everything I've seen, I still try hard not to believe any of it. "Oh, Jesus," Barton cried. It only took a second for the camera to reveal what the diver had seen. The hellish scene that had sparked such a haunted response, and I unleashed a similar yelp of terror. We all recoiled fearfully, in fact. I suppose none of us had hypothesized what we might find in the wreckage, even when the debate about movement and biological signatures had raged. There was no joyous hysteria. This was not like those early days of the GE1 project. Nobody seemed exuberant to find 3 floating spacesuits at the front of the spacecraft. Spacesuits that were not empty. Spacesuits that were, surprisingly, intact. It had taken roughly a day or so since the GE1 crash for the divers to breach the vessel, 24 hours for the bodies to decompose underwater. The skin of each astronaut was discolored and wounded with haunting razor-thin gashes, but their gaunt faces were unmistakable. The 2 men and 1 woman, each wearing a scream to the grave, were the 3 astronauts who had returned to Earth 1 year earlier. Worst of all was the corpse of Commander Tim Irwin. The upper half of his helmet and the head within had been cleanly severed above his gaping mouth. That explained the rotten nature of his remaining lower half, in comparison to Diane's and Olsen, who were each encased in a suit without oxygen. The ship's oxygen would have lasted at least a month or so, resulting in partial decay of Irwin's remaining face, exposed by the savagely sawn helmet. The lower half of his face bore holes in the cheeks, revealing teeth behind. One scientist murmured that the 3 scientists may have died long before impact. Within a sealed spacesuit, lacking oxygen, the decomposition process would be slowed. Of course, that only raised more terrified questions. One, in particular, played on my mind. Why were the astronauts wearing suits inside the spacecraft? A technical engineer gave a probable explanation for the ship's return. The GE1 was programmed with a homing initiative. In the event of life loss, or 24 hours without manual piloting, the craft's motherboard was programmed to assume automatic control of GE1 and steer it back to Earth. The re-entry might have failed because the ship was damaged. That might also explain why we didn't receive a signal from its transmitter. Honestly, it's a miracle that the GE1 made it back to Earth at all, the engineer said. We'll know more when we look at the ship's log, another engineer added. Dr. Parker sighed. Barton, we need you to... We have to get out of here, Lee yelled, shouting over Dr. Parker. I didn't sign up for this. Look, we did the dive. You've seen what you needed to see. I understand that this is a terrible situation, Parker continued. You were, however, briefed. You signed a contract, Mr. Lee. The nature of the expedition was made clear to you, and we don't have all of the information that we need. We need you to recover as much of the ship's data as possible. Do you have the drive? Yes, Barton murmured, dazed by the 3 floating corpses. Right, Parker replied. You should see the socket on the right-hand side. The lead diver swam towards the main console, searching anxiously with the navigational assistance of every expert in the room. When he finally inserted the drive into the designated socket, a red light flickered beside it. What does that mean? Barton asked. You were right, Ian, one of the technical engineers said to his colleague. It's not good, Mr. Barton. It means that some of the ship's log files are corrupted. All of them? Dr. Parker asked. The engineer rubbed his chin. Well, if there'd been no light at all, this would have been a lost cause. So, there's still hope. It'll be the water damage. No doubt about that. Just leave the drive in the socket, Mr. Barton. Let it run. When the light turns off, that means the data transfer has finished. Meanwhile, Lee was scanning the ship with equipment for detecting organic matter. I was standing by, waiting for the diver's device to detect some sign of life, something that would warrant me being in the room. But there was nothing, not even any sign of the movement that the UV-7 had detected. I was the uncomfortable biologist in the corner, only there, it seemed, to endure the horror alongside everyone else. Something that did intrigue Mission Control, however, was Lee's discovery of floating glass shards in Daines's laboratory. Most people wouldn't pay attention to suspended glass fragments in an underwater wreckage. The divers certainly didn't understand the commotion from the scientists, and neither did I, but Lee indulged Dr. Parker when he was instructed to collect a sample. It's just broken glass, I naively thought, frowning. 10 minutes later, when the data transfer completed, Barton recovered the drive, and the 2 divers were beyond happy to receive the go-ahead from Dr. Parker to leave the site. The men returned to the submarine, the transmission ended, and everybody in the control room dispersed. I didn't sleep that night, of course. No sane person would manage a good night's sleep after such an awful discovery. When I went into work that morning, I hadn't expected to see video footage of 3 dead astronauts. More terrifying than that, I hadn't expected to see footage of 3 corpses who I'd seen return to Earth, alive and well. "Earl," Dr. Parker half barked. I was sitting in my office, boring into the wall with a 1,000-yard stare. It took the man 3 attempts to catch my attention. Using my first name had triggered something in my brain, taken me out of myself for a moment, reminded me that this was all real. No matter how hard I tried to dissociate and detach myself, I was excruciatingly intertwined with the horror. "Dr. Parker," I replied, unable to say anything else. "I'm afraid I have to ask you once again to come with me," the man said, seeming far paler than usual. "We just reviewed the data from the GE1 wreckage." "What did you find?" I whispered, voice breaking. Parker sighed. "If you come to my office, you'll see. I really need your opinion." That seemed like a lie to me. Dr. Parker had been talking about the importance of my opinion as a biologist since the start of the GE1 program. In the end, I'd simply been a limp, lifeless limb, hardly even a backup appendage. Just some excess fat that somebody had forgotten to trim. As it would transpire, however, Dr. Parker had finally found something that required my input. Out of 102 audio files on the drive, only 2 were uncorrupted. 2 recordings from Commander Tim Irwin. Within those recordings, Dr. Parker heard something he didn't understand. Heard many things he didn't understand. Unfortunately, I scarcely understood the recordings either. What little I did understand, however, horrified me, and I saw that coming. It was foreshadowed by the project leader, by his haunted eyes. The board need to know whether they've found something alien in nature, Dr. Odell. I still don't think It's not organic. I don't believe that. They won't listen to me, Dr. Parker said, but they'll listen to you. I could tell that the man no longer believed his own words. He wanted me to prove him wrong. File 86. This is Commander Tim Irwin. I am recording this message at 14:40 on Thursday, 2nd February, 2023, Greenwich Mean Time. Since 12:15 today, we have been unable to contact Mission Control. Olson has not pinpointed any malfunction, so we hope that all remains well back home. The 3 of us are contemplating the possibility that the issue with our broadcasting signal stems from what we have discovered, the source of the 784A frequency. We found it, and, given what we have experienced over the past 2 hours, I believe it to be vital for me to record our findings in the absence of any communication with Dr. Parker. At roughly 12:35, shortly after losing contact with home, we finally saw a physical manifestation of the frequency that we've been hunting for 8 days. We were starting to think there would be nothing there. We'd been eyeing blackness for hours, believing that the transmission had no visible source. It was when we neared a mile or less from the signal's source that we finally saw something tangible. I'm still struggling to describe our discovery. Well, at first we didn't know how to put it into words. Now, however, I suppose I'd say that we were pursuing an ever-moving belt of glass shards. Yes, glass shards. You heard me correctly. Thousands of small glass-like fragments hurtling through the cosmos. Jagged pieces of some unknown material. No sign of biological life, no sign of foreign technology. Just a near-transparent substance with no technological or organic nature, somehow transmitting the 784A frequency. That revelation might disappoint some people back home, those hoping for signs of alien life. Still, I know that Dr. Parker and other minds behind this mission will be extremely fascinated by this discovery. At 12:55, after a brief preparation period, we used the B-1 craft to retrieve a sample of glass from the moving belt. I understand that, though we were cleared to use the equipment without approval, Dr. Parker may be a little disheartened. I know he wanted to experience this with us. I just hope he'll understand. We didn't want to wait for the line of communication to reopen. After all, we didn't know whether we'd have another opportunity. We had no way of knowing how the mysterious belt of glass would react to our presence, even though GE1 still wasn't picking up organic or electronic signatures. Diane's keeps talking about the possibility of something sentient lurking in the shards. Until we detect something organic, I doubt that. The belt was, and still is, moving at a rather glacial pace of roughly 6,000 miles per hour. We will have no trouble pursuing it in the GE1. As I speak, we are trundling alongside the glass stream at a crawl. It stretches for hundreds of miles. Who knows how many shards are contained within the stream? With regards to recovering glass pieces from the belt, the B-1 craft suffered catastrophic damage, which intrigued us. No form of glass on Earth would be powerful enough, even at such a speed, to tear through the B-1's reinforced hull. That only confirmed what we already knew. This isn't glass. It isn't anything we understand. Upon realizing that, we knew we had to retrieve a sample, regardless of the damage to B-1. The small craft only managed to collect a meager handful of passing shards, but that was enough. We didn't want to push our luck, so we brought it back within a matter of minutes. I'll send over the data logs as soon as the communication is fixed. You'll see what I mean. The miniature vessel was almost obliterated by the belt, and we didn't want to lose an opportunity to claim at least something. At 13:20, Dr. Jana Dianes examined the 7 shards, recovered by the B-1 craft, in her laboratory. She instructed Olson and I to wear protective gear before joining her, as she had no idea exactly what we'd found. We giddily watched Dianes conduct her tests. She was giddy too, in all honesty, though she attempted to maintain a professional composure. We're aware, whatever we've retrieved, that it is unlike anything humanity has seen before. Dr. Dianes confirmed around 1420 what we'd seen in GE1's data. The shards do not contain organic matter. Each piece is composed of a raw material not present on Earth or any other planet we've ever explored. Shortly before I started this recording, however, Olson became a little jittery. He told Dianes and me that he saw one of the shards enlarge, or at least move in some form. It was likely a trick of the lighting, of course. Dianes took him seriously, but she found no evidence of any change in the material. I suggested that, moving forwards, we set up cameras to record the laboratory. Dianes and Olson agreed. That'll ensure we don't miss anything. I'll send everything to Mission Control as soon as Olson has figured out how to fix the transmitter, though he assures me that it remains unbroken. Bizarre. Anyway, interference from the 784A frequency seems to be the most likely explanation, but we're still unsure. I will continue to log daily updates. For now, the 3 of us need to get some rest. It's been a historic day, but we're shattered. None of us have slept in over a day. This is Commander Tim Irwin, audio file 86. Terminating recording at 1450. I need you to brace yourself, Dr. Parker said. I snapped back into reality, having been fully immersed in the wonder of the crew's discovery, much like Commander Irwin. I'd almost forgotten the gravity of the situation, forgotten the terror that NASA had found at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. Brace myself for what? The next audio file? I asked. Dr. Parker nodded. We just listened to 86. The only other uncorrupted recording is 99. So we're missing 12 files in between those? I asked. Yes, he answered. And 3 files after 99. The board doesn't care about the first 85 audio files, the ones before we lost contact with GE1. Meaningless updates that would likely mirror whatever Commander Irwin was telling Mission Control on a daily basis. But the audio recordings from 86 to 1 and 2 detail whatever happened after the vessel went dark. Those are, perhaps, the most valuable pieces of data this organization currently possesses. Right. Is file 99 useful? I asked. The doctor's lip quivered as he hovered his unsteady index finger over the mouse, contemplating whether to inflict such horror upon me. I wish he hadn't. Useful? That's an interesting word. I don't know, Dr. Odell. It tells one horrifying part of a story we don't understand, Parker croaked before clicking. File 99. This is Irwin. 99. File 99. Since the last few recordings, it's all over. And things were already terrible. This must be my 5th recording today. I'm sorry. Sorry for the backlog of files for you to... Oh, who cares? Why am I apologizing to anyone? Nobody's there. Nobody will ever be there. I'll be lost to space and... Well, I hope somebody hears it. There's the protocol, after all. The return protocol. I'm no engineer, but I remember Olson talking about it. If GE1 makes it back to Earth, I hope these recordings make sense to you. Whoever's listening, none of this makes sense to me. And it's even worse now. Dianes is gone. She died at, I don't know, 2210 perhaps. Fuck. It's Tuesday, 7th February, 2240. I'm the only surviving member of the GE1 crew. You know how it happened. I just want her family to know that I tried to save her. Oh God, this all started with a reckless endeavor. We should have turned around when we saw the vessel outside the window. It's still there. I'm looking at it now. GE1. An identical version of our spacecraft, eyeballing me from the belt, impervious to the racing current of glass. You know what? I'd like to amend my statement. We should have turned around as soon as we lost contact with mission control. This was written on the wall. Everything about the belt was wrong. We knew it, but we were drooling from our mouths like apes. Olsen's idea was smart. It was smart. It just wasn't enough. We should have thought about B1, thought about how the glass tore through it. Olsen promised, however, that this would be different. The belt was moving so quickly, after all. He said the shards weren't as dangerous outside of the belt. We wanted to believe him. Maybe I still want to believe him. After all, I'm wearing my suit, even though I know it didn't save him. And it didn't save Diane's either. I spent most of the day trying to stop the bleeding, but it was awful. You heard it. You don't need me to tell you. I still hear her words, ringing in my ears, the things she described, the way it cut into her skin, and then disappeared. The glass disappeared after hacking her face to pieces. It was so methodical and quick, so eerily quick, but not in a merciful way. Her dying scream will never leave my mind, neither will the sight of that sharp shard, unbound by the laws of physics, slicing her face with clean, swift motions, a weapon wielded by an unseen force. I've locked the lab. That won't be enough, will it? It wasn't enough to stop. Oh, there it goes. That's why I wanted to record this. I keep seeing something in the copied version of the GE1 spacecraft, gliding 100 yards away from the real one. I keep seeing movement behind the windows. Oh God, 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 God! No, there's no God. Not in the... I see them so clearly now, but they're dead. Olsen and Diane's are dead. Their bodies are still sitting in the control room. I'm looking at them, and I'm also there across the way, surveying me from the flight deck of the copied craft. What is happening? What is this? They won't stop looking at me. They won't stop. I want to turn around. I want to stop following the belt. I've wanted to abandon the mission for days, but Diane's made a good point. After Olsen passed, she said that we shouldn't head back with the shards on board. We were just too frightened to go near the glass after he died. Without Diane's, I don't see myself solving this. I just have to soldier onwards. Keep tracking things. Keep moving. I'll record an update tomorrow, but I won't abandon this mission. Not until I talk to somebody from Mission Control. Whatever material we've found, I don't think I should come home unless I get rid of it. So I wait, do you hear that? That's what I heard before. When it happened to Diane's, when the glass moved, changed into something, I don't know. It looked like liquid, like a thin trail of water with a slight sheen. It crawled across the walls before climbing her suit and somehow slithering beneath the visor. I don't know how it entered, and then it started solidifying. She was running around, screaming, wrestling with her own helmet. Give me a second. I need to check the lab. Yes, there are fewer pieces of glass. That's the other thing. 4. There are only 4 shards. We collected 7 from the belt. There were definitely 7. Then 6, after the mirrored version of the GE1 craft appeared outside the window. 5, after we found Olsen's body in the airlock. 4, after it took Diane's... Wait, no, there were 4 after Diane's died. At 22:10. It's 22:43, and I only see 3 shards in there. Sitting on her desk. But the door's locked. There's no sign of exit. Where did the 4th one go? Where did it fucking go? God fucking damn it. I don't know how much longer I'll be able to wait. I want to come home more than anything. See Melissa. See the little ones. But that's exactly why I won't come back. It would be selfish. It wouldn't be right to let them live on an Earth with the risk of these shards. Stop looking at me. Both of you. Stop it. What are you? You're not them. They're dead. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for recording all of this. It would have been better not to know, wouldn't it? It would have been better not to know. Commander Tim Irwin, audio file 99, terminating recording at 22:45. After the audio ended, Dr. Parker and I sat quietly, not silently. I could hear my own heartbeat in the quaking canals of my ears. I could hear the project leader hyperventilating, failing to hide a fearful murmur that sounded at the back of his throat. He'd already heard the two files, of course. I had no idea how he'd managed to maintain any semblance of professionalism. He knew what was coming. He knew what I was about to hear. But he said nothing. Did nothing. I was crumbling from the haunting revelations in the last surviving recording of Commander Irwin. I hated Dr. Parker for involving me in the GE1 program. "Think about what we saw," the man eventually whispered. I looked at him without uttering a word, giving the scientist time to continue. "Think about the body of Tim Irwin," Parker explained. "What remained of it. I need, more than anything in the world, to hear File 102, the commander's final recording on Friday, 17th February, 2023. "That was after the GE1 landed," I said. He shuddered. "It wasn't the GE1, Dr. Odell. You know that now. I'm thinking about the shards recovered from the wreckage. What happened to those?" I asked, gripped by a fresh wave of terror. Dr. Parker lowered his head. "Scientists are examining the fragments. Dr. Zeeland's team, now you've listened to the audio files, I'd like you to lend your expertise in his laboratory." "Right, well, I've remembered something else," I said. "The video footage from the dive. Do you remember seeing the glass in GE1's laboratory?" "I've hardly thought of anything else," he replied. "Commander Irwin said, in the final uncorrupted recording, that only 3 shards remained. But there were more than 3 shards in that water," I quivered. Parker frowned. "I don't know what to say to that, Earl. The shards could have shattered during the crash, split into numerous smaller fragments." I didn't believe that. Not from the description the commander had given. These were sturdy, unnatural things. Things which could change shape and state. Not things that would shatter. "Anyway, Dr. Odell," the scientist muttered, clearing his throat. "Before we go to Zeeland's lab, I'd like to ask for your opinion. GE1 found no evidence of organic matter in the belt. Dr. Gianna Diane's found no evidence of organic matter in the shard samples. Given the commander's description in File 99, however, do you think that the ship's data log may have been wrong? Do you think Dr. Diane's may have been wrong?" I sighed. "There isn't enough evidence for me to give a definite answer to that question, Dr. Parker. Not until I see the shards for myself." I regretted saying that. I didn't want to see the shards. I wanted to run away, wash my hands of the whole thing. File 99 had filled me with a bottomless dread that I didn't realize the human body could experience. It haunted me. The thought of an unfeeling thing stealing one's form and then shredding that same person to pieces. The commander was right. It would be the worst thing imaginable for the substance to make its way back to Earth. But it was all over when the glass mimicked the spacecraft. The shards have already been here for a year. "You're too late," Dr. Zeeland said. That line snapped my mind into action. I had zoned out of the earlier conversation with the scientist, still trying desperately to process the horror of the past few days. It was nearly impossible to process something far beyond our world, something the human mind has not evolved to process. Dr. Parker scoffed. "Dr. Odell needs to." "Dr. Odell is too late," Zeeland interrupted. "We disposed of the shards this morning." "I beg your pardon?" I asked. "The fragments were dangerous. The audio recordings made that abundantly clear. Dr. Long ordered us to destroy the samples," Dr. Zeeland said. At that moment, Veronica Riding emerged from the lab, which was being barricaded by Dr. Zeeland's hulking form. The sheepish woman was pushing a trolley of black waste bags, and she seemed to be trying to avoid detection. Regardless, hope sparked in my mind, as Veronica was a close friend of mine, not just a colleague. I hoped she would clear up the strangeness of the situation. The idea of NASA discarding such an important historical find seemed unthinkable to me. It was a lovely thought. There's no denying that. I wanted to entertain the possibility of the agency putting mankind's safety before mankind's progression. But I'm not a moron. "Veronica," I called. "Is it true?" "What was that, Dr. Odell?" she asked, stopping to face me. My body temperature lowered. As I eyed the face of my dear friend, I felt the shift. I didn't see a physical difference in Veronica's appearance as such. The shift in my fractured mind was more subtle than that. It was a feeling that whisked the contents of my gut. Veronica always called me Earl. As a kid, my best friend said it's easy to get away with murder. Now I'm worried he wasn't just boasting. My friend Sam has always been troubled, the sort of kid you knew would go down the wrong path and wind up in the news. I remember when the story about Daniel Petrick came out. He was that teen who back in 2007 took his father's gun from a safe after his parents took away Halo 3. He came up behind them while they were on the sofa watching TV, told them he had a surprise for them, and shot them both in the back of the head. Not long after the Petrick story came out, I remember Sam laughing and telling me, "Dummy got caught almost immediately. If I were ever going to do something like that, I'd be smarter about it." We lived only 3 houses apart, so we used to hang out a lot. Sam was obsessed with true crime, which meant we watched a ton of it. He was drawn to the most heinous stuff, like Catherine Knight, the woman who in 2000 butchered her husband and cooked him up into a meal and hung his skin up to dry. The officers who came to her house brushed against the skin, thinking it was a curtain. This was way inappropriate for 12-year-olds, of course, but neither of us had very involved parents. Maybe because of all this stuff, Sam was convinced that evil was pretty much everywhere. "Dude," he said, "if this is how much we see, the people who are caught, how many do you think get away with it?" "Not many," I said confidently. "If they did, we'd hear about it in the news. People would be disappearing. But think how many might be labeled accidents, but are really murders? Falls down the stairs, heart attacks. I bet so many people bump off old folks when they don't want to take care of them or want their money." "Doubt it," I said again. "It would be so easy," said Sam. "I bet there's tons of murders sliding under the radar because people just don't expect you to actually kill. So easy." In hindsight, this conversation screams red flag, but as kids we both had a morbid fascination with this stuff. But by far Sam's biggest obsession was the piano wire killer, who strangled 4 women in our city and was never caught. I found out from Sam's dad, not from Sam himself, that one of the victims was actually Sam's older half-sister. She was abducted in '99 when Sam was only 4 years old. Like all the victims, she was found naked, her body recovered from the tunnels under Nicollet Island. And finally, I understood the motive for his true crime obsession. He wanted to catch the person who'd killed his sister. He was trying to understand how it happened. When I asked him about her, he claimed to remember her singing to him and playing on the swings, and admitted he watched every scrap of news relating to her death that he could. So that summer, I suggested we search, go into the tunnels and look for clues. Bro, Sam's eyes lit up. That would be dope. We spent a whole summer scoping out those tunnels, winding through unlit utility passages, seemingly forever through the cool dark. If you know your way, you can crawl through a narrow passage to Satan's Cave, where teens and urban explorers sneak in to drink, light up, and graffiti their names. There are even some carvings on the cave walls people have made of goat heads and demon faces. But it's mostly just discarded beer bottles and trash. The explorations were thrilling, but the closest we found to anything suspicious was a switchblade, a discarded baby doll, and a loop of wire that seemed likely to have come from a bracelet. Sam insisted the news was all wrong, that the killer wasn't anything like people suspected. Maybe he was right, but he was wrong about the tunnels. There was no evidence there of any killer whatsoever, piano wire or otherwise. After that summer, our interests shifted from true crime to video games. We played lots of shooters. I got into sports, taekwondo, and later rowing, backpacking, any wilderness stuff. Sam got into drugs. We'd still occasionally meet up for a hike. I'd go for the nature, he'd go for the opportunity to light up and escape his parents' constant squabbles. But I saw less and less of him. By the time I entered college, he was in and out of jail, getting in trouble for dealing, for breaking and entering, petty crime stuff. The last time I heard from him was when he called me from jail, asking me to bail him out, reminding me what good friends we used to be, reminiscing. "Hey Rufus," he said, "remember that summer we spent searching the tunnels?" Yeah. Pretty transparent, trying to tug at my heartstrings with a bond that had wilted years ago, but I smiled anyway because those were better times. "That was dope," he said. "We never did find much, did we?" "Nope. Bet if we searched those tunnels now, things would be different." "Hey, maybe we go again once I'm out, yeah?" "Sure. So, I was wondering if you could do me a favor." "Yeah, okay, I was a sucker. I went and bailed him out later that day. We made plans to hang out, maybe to explore those tunnels again. I knew he'd blow me off, but what can I say? He was an old friend, and I felt bad that he'd wound up this way while my life was pretty steady. What's more, he'd found out while in custody that his dad had died. Suicide, apparently. Which was not a surprise to anyone who knew Sam's father, but nonetheless surely must have hit Sam hard. Sam was worried now about his mom, having to raise his baby sister alone. Plus, they needed money. They always needed money. He wanted to go check up on the two of them, make sure they were doing okay without his dad. I told him I was here if he or his family needed any help. I gave him my condolences. He just smiled and told me thanks, and didn't mention his father again on the drive back. "You know they actually found new evidence in the case?" he said to me when I dropped him off. "Shit, really?" "Yeah." The ghost of a smile. "I'll tell you about it next week." But he didn't get a chance. I got a voice call from him 2 days before we were supposed to meet up. The call dropped before I could answer. When I tried calling him back, it rang a few times and stopped. My subsequent calls went straight to voicemail. Sam ghosting me was nothing new, but when our appointed meetup passed and he still wasn't replying to me, I messaged his mom. She said he'd left ranting about the piano wire killer and the tunnels, but she thought it was just his usual talk. He was always spouting big ideas and conspiracy theories, never amounting to anything. She started to complain how she'd thrown her back out, and with him running off again, there was no one to help but Maisie, his little sister. The trash and laundry were too heavy for her to lift by herself. I told her I'd come by later, but now I was truly worried for Sam. Called, messaged, even reported my concerns to police, but they jumped right to assuming he'd skipped town to avoid a court hearing, which was, I admit, a pretty plausible assumption. No trace of him anywhere. Still no signal from his phone. He'd gotten out of jail, mentioned new evidence, arranged to meet me, and vanished. I decided to check the tunnels. The entrance we'd used as kids was smaller and more overgrown than I remembered. I climbed down the embankment through brush and dry leaves, out onto the concrete ledge, and then ducked into the cool darkness of the tunnel with its low ceiling and narrow walls. Flicked on my flashlight. The faint odor of sewage wafted to my nostrils as I made my way forward, the only sound the echo of my boots treading on the concrete. After a while of running my hand along the cool brick, I paused and turned to glance behind me. The entrance had become a distant square of white light. Was this really a good idea? Well, obviously not. I might go stumbling into whatever had caused Sam to disappear. Besides which, I couldn't remember the directions to Satan's cave. And even if I did find my way in, what was I supposed to be looking for? You know they actually found new evidence in the case? Sam's hint in our last conversation had me tugging out my phone, searching the news, and I was stunned at the headline that came up. 25 years after brutal killings, piano wire killer confesses. Whoa. Sam had seriously downplayed this. It wasn't just new evidence. The killer was actually in custody and had confessed. So where the fuck was Sam then? Maybe the police were right about him skipping town, leaving his mother alone to look after his sister, me scrambling to find him, and no one to pick up the pieces from his shattered life. I sighed and headed over to help his mom take out the trash. Sam's car was in the back when I pulled up, and my spirits lifted. I was eager to chew him out for all the usual trouble, but when I got inside, his mom told me he wasn't back yet. His car battery had died, and he'd left by bike a few days ago. The house was a mess, filled with empty pizza boxes, several full garbage bags, laundry piled up. Sam's mom, Eleanor, had thrown her back out, I remembered, and couldn't lift heavy things, so without Sam, she had no one to take out the trash or carry loads of laundry besides Maisie, and Maisie wasn't a very consistent helper, being only 11 years old. "Is that Rufus?" Maisie came bounding down as I was collecting the trash bags. Her nose wrinkled. "It smells like ass in here." "You should help your mom more," I said. Once I'd cleared the trash out, I was getting ready to leave when on a sudden impulse, I went upstairs to the room Sam had been using, thinking he might have left me some hint as to where he'd gone. But I found the room taped off with a giant "Keep Out" sign. Maisie, bouncing up the stairs after me, told me no one was allowed in. "Especially me," she added, making a face. Well, I'm his best friend, so I'm allowed, I said, but the door was locked. Undeterred, I started opening drawers downstairs in the main room. When we were little, Sam would sometimes lock his door and his parents would open it and tell him not to shut them out. I vaguely remembered there being a key kept in a junk drawer. While searching, I called out to Sam's mom asking if she'd heard anything from him. She shouted back from the basement, "He'll turn up eventually, like a bad penny." I grunted and opened a desk drawer, no keys, just old electronics and cell phones, and closed it. Then, opened it again and blinked. Sam's cell phone. I recognized it from the day I bailed him out. As soon as I had it in my hand, its heavy solidity made my pulse ratchet up. I brought it out to my car and plugged it in. Started up the phone. Couldn't get past the password. After a few more tries, I went back inside. Sam's mom was still doing laundry. I told Maisie to go sit in my car, that I'd take her to get ice cream in a few minutes, and then I went upstairs. My heart was pounding harder now. The unpleasant odor still lingered, despite the garbage having been cleared out. Sweat pooled under my armpits as I peeled the tape off the door and put my shoulder against it. It didn't require much force. A couple of short bursts and I flung it open. Sam's bed was unmade. Laundry on the floor. Dirty dishes. Messy, like his life. No sign of him. My eyes turned to the closet, to the faint stain of reddish-brown on the carpet. I slid the door open, wobbly in its tracks. My eyes watered. The stench hit me, like sewage and old meat. I closed the door and dialed the police. I bet there's tons of murders sliding under the radar because people just don't expect you to actually kill. So easy. After unlocking Sam's phone, the police discovered he'd been drafting me an email. It included a link to a more detailed article about the piano wire killer's confession. A confession to 3 of the 4 murders, but not to the murder of Sam's sister. Police suspected, even back in 1999, that it was a copycat killing, suspected because the type of wire used to strangle her didn't match with the other victims. Over the years, I'd forgotten this detail. Sam never did. His mom was still downstairs when the police arrived, and I showed them his body, tucked into the closet and curled as if asleep, but rotting, leaking. Only later would the pieces fall into place. That even as a child, he'd suspected his mother of murdering the half-sister who was born from another woman. That the entire summer we explored the tunnels, that's what he was really looking for. Evidence to connect his mother to her death. We found nothing back then. But these past weeks, the piano wire killer's confession brought it all back. A confession Sam's father likely read, but by the time Sam got out of custody, his father was dead. Sam was looking for proof, not only of his sister's murder, but also his father's. He died of blunt force trauma to the head. Unlike his sister's or father's deaths, which were planned carefully enough, even now it was hard to prove them, police seemed to think his was improvised. Perhaps he confronted his mother, or perhaps she caught him snooping. She likely threw her back out trying to move his body. Sticking him in the closet and sealing the room was a stopgap measure. But even so, she might have gotten away with it, and I might have assumed he was still out in the world somewhere, running into trouble like always, if I hadn't seen his phone. It would be so easy. I never knew when he said this that he was voicing suspicions about his own mother. No wonder his worldview was so bleak, his sense of people one of constant mistrust. He didn't confide in anyone, not even me. But I'm glad the truth is finally out. I just wonder how many deaths, how many assumed accidents, how many heinous misdeeds go flying under the radar, like he says. I'm worried that my best friend has always been right, and it's so much more than we realize. My wife, Samira, had been working in art restoration for years and was finally promoted to the head of her department. She's always been a talented artist, and the science behind it was an added bonus in her mind. I was so incredibly proud. It was her dream job. At first, for that first year, she was ecstatic. Even when she worked 60 hours a week, even as she was restoring famous pieces of art, or pieces so old that any mistake or misinterpretation would be quite literally destroying history. Her words, not mine. She was truly happy. During her career, we'd developed a tradition. I'd meet her at the museum for lunch, and she'd gush about her work. If she could safely take a picture, no flash of course, she assured me, of what she was working on, she'd proudly show me. But a month ago, something changed. I first noticed it in her eyes as we were eating dinner. She stared off into the distance, an unreadable expression on her face. She looked more exhausted than I'd seen her in a long time. "So, what are you working on?" I tried to break the silence. Usually she volunteered the information freely and with excitement, but she had been quiet on this piece, almost avoidant. "You may have heard of this one." Her face finally lit up. "Blind portrait." I shook my head, asked if she could show me. For the first time, she told me no. But maybe I'd recognize it when she was done with it. "You're going to love it when you see it," she replied slyly. It wasn't one of their pieces, she informed me. It was from another prestigious museum, and she was assisting with the restoration after their own team had tried but couldn't finish it. Not the way it deserved, she added. They'd failed. The way she described the piece was with so much affection, I could see why she was pouring so many hours into it. But not long after, she began to change. Her already grueling hours transitioned into her practically living at the museum. When I went to meet her there for lunch, she'd ignore me, sequester herself in the lab instead until I gave up and went back to work. Days would pass without me seeing her, but in the instances I did, I could tell something was eating away at her. She looked exhausted. Her once beautiful hazel eyes had been the color of honey with flecks of greens, blues, and browns. They were the first thing I'd noticed about her when I met her. Had begun to look duller and bloodshot, almost as if they were receding into her head. They were ringed with dark circles, and I could have sworn she was even losing hair over it. Over the next week, I must have asked her how she was doing 1,000 times, because she seemed to always have panic written on her face, but she never answered. Eventually, she confided in me the source of her stress. "They say I'm not moving fast enough. I'm not putting enough into it. It's never enough." She looked at me, her eyes red, but tearless, as if she'd already been crying for hours and had nothing left. "It needs to be ready. It needs to be seen, but I'm running out of supplies." She added after studying me for a long moment in a way that made me feel oddly uncomfortable. I was incredibly pissed off with her employer on her behalf. Samira has always been one of the hardest workers I've ever known. I'm not just saying that because she's my wife either. She puts her all into every single piece of art she restores, and I'd never heard of them trying to rush her to that extent before. The next morning, I woke up covered in a series of small but deep cuts, the sheets dotted with dried sticky blood, a small but clear bloody handprint on the bedroom door. Not long after, she brought it home, something I knew she was not allowed to do. I'd learned enough from her years on the job to know that depending on the medium, the pieces were only supposed to be exposed to certain kinds of light, environments, and temperature. She had always treated the art she worked on with so much love and respect, so when I saw her walking to our old and dirty shed, with it clutched to her chest, wrapped in a filthy-looking sheet, I knew something was very wrong. The next afternoon, I'd got off work early. I had hoped to have a serious conversation with her that night, figured I'd do some projects around the house while I planned out what I was going to say. I turned on the garage light and jumped. She was standing there in the dark, motionless, even though she should have been at work. "Babe, you feeling okay? Did you come home sick? Where's the saw?" She spoke as if she hadn't heard me, her voice strained, almost like she'd been screaming for hours on end. If I hadn't seen her speak the words, I would have never guessed that sound could have ever come out of her mouth. I was so surprised that my thoughts of some sort of intervention were forgotten. "Which one?" She stared down at her hand in silence for a long moment, flexed her fingers. "Circular," she rasped. "Do you want help?" She cradled the saw in her arms, turned, and left without answering me. She was down there all day. I could hear the blade whirring as it struggled to cut through some hard material, even from the house. She finally made an appearance at dinner that evening, but she was pale and walked in swaying steps, her right hand bundled in thick bandages. I felt sick and guilty at the sight of blood staining through it. She refused to let me see her injury and screamed violently at me when I told her we needed to go to the ER. I'm not one to meddle in her work life, but I'd reached my breaking point. I decided I needed to talk to her boss, Leslie. She and Samira had worked together for so long that we knew her pretty well. We even had dinner with her and her family a few times. So I drove up to the museum and I asked for her. I wasn't sure what I expected when I went up there. A heated argument, a confrontation. But the moment she saw me, she pulled me into an awkward hug. "Alan, I'm so sorry we had to suspend her. How is she? We were hoping she'd get some help." The confusion I felt must have been written on my face because her expression changed to match my own. "She didn't tell you?" I just shook my head dumbly, thoroughly thrown off by the chain of events. "Samira, she spent every moment working on that horrible painting. We're not even sure where it came from. It isn't one of ours." "She said it was from some other museum that you were helping out." I attempted to pronounce it a few times before finally giving up. She frowned. "No, we aren't partnered with anyone right now. We've got too much of our own work to take on anyone else's. That's why we had to put her on leave. Yes, she was neglecting her work here, but it was the effect that it had on her that worried us. That piece, it was disgusting. I don't say this often, but that wasn't art. Art has soul, something to give you. That piece had nothing to give, it only wanted to take." I drove home, angry and dumbfounded that my normally honest-to-a-fault wife had been lying to me for weeks. I called out gently for Samira, but she wasn't in the house. I approached our storage shed turned workshop to check on her, but she wasn't there either. I approached the painting. She had made no effort to hide what she was doing. It was like she didn't even think it was wrong. Where do I even begin? The painting itself was an atrocity. I'd looked up blind portrait since she refused to show me. After her concerning behavior, I felt I needed to know what it was that she was working on. I didn't find any one specific piece with that name. Instead, that a blind portrait was exactly what it sounded like. One drawn without the artist looking, maybe as a creative exercise or to practice fundamentals. But no, the painting my wife was working on was immaculate. Someone had clearly crafted it with their full vision and attention. It was exquisitely drawn down to the smallest of details. I'm no expert, but the smoothness, the way colors were blended, the detail of the clothing and hair against a backdrop of swirling reds, it was captivating. I'm no expert, but felt it would have even been a masterpiece if it hadn't been so goddamn disturbing. The subject, a woman, was beautiful, or rather she would have been, if the flesh above the exposed teeth wasn't torn in such a way that it almost resembled a playful curling of the upper lip. The teeth, the top row since the bottom jaw was totally gone, a stark white against the background that were so detailed, so realistic, roots and all, that they looked like I could reach out and touch them. I realized why the portrait was called blind. The young woman, she had no eyes, rather just dark holes in her skull where they should have been. The twin streams of blood and damage to the delicate skin around them that the artist focused on in painstaking detail suggested they had been there at some point, though. The longer I stared, the more I felt tempted to reach out and touch it, to complete it. I felt myself striding towards it, clawing at my skin, reaching for my eyes. She'd looked so incredible with a pair of her own. What finally snapped me out of it was when I got close enough for the smell to hit me. It was so overpowering that my eyes began watering profusely, breaking my eye contact with it. I couldn't help but gag when I realized how exactly Samira had been restoring it. The reds of the background behind the woman, they held the odor of copper and faint decay of old blood mixed with paint. Long bits of white bone with cut marks had been haphazardly added to fill the missing portions of the frame. The teeth, there was a reason they looked so realistic. Exposed roots placed lovingly, completing where the woman's should have been. Samira had flashed me an odd, but otherwise perfect smile just the night before. I wondered how many others had tried restoring the painting. What exactly had she meant when she said that they failed? Leslie's words about the painting only taking were fresh in my mind. I waited up for Samira for hours that night. I eventually heard her come in and the sound of our ancient sofa protest as she fell into it. "Babe," I whispered cautiously, "we need to talk." She ignored me, her back turned, and eventually I headed back upstairs. I should have never left her. I should have tried harder to get her help. She was gone again in the morning. I searched for her in the house before finally finding her standing in a shadowy corner of the dark shed. She was painting what appeared to be crudely drawn, swirling faces with her fingers. Even in the scant light, I could tell what medium she was using to paint with. I tried to go to her. Clearly something was very wrong, and she needed my help. But mid-step, I found myself turning to approach the painting instead. As much as I hated it, as much as it sickened me, I couldn't get it out of my mind ever since I'd seen it. I needed to see it. I needed to complete it. I choked back a sob when I moved back the fabric covering it. I still hate myself for the fleeting pang of jealousy that I felt. It was finished. There was a new addition since the last time I'd seen it. A pair of perfect hazel eyes